Time to join. Great. And so this will live in perpetuity on YouTube afterward. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join. Thank you, Conrad, so much for joining us today. It's a real honor to have you here, and I think it's a great honor to Conrad too that so many people have joined online and here today. So thank you for taking the time. I want to briefly introduce Conrad before Conrad's talk, and then the plan is for Conrad to share for about 15-20 minutes in a kind of conversational way, so that afterwards you can discuss what Conrad shared, how it relates to things that you're doing, things that we're interested in. So hope it's kind of a chance for us all to engage with the ideas Conrad shares. One other kind of programming note, especially for the PhD students who are on Zoom and in person, this is definitely a chance for you to engage and share your ideas. So please in no way feel like you should censor yourself or wait until others talk. You're more than welcome to engage with Conrad and be part of the discussion. Okay, so as a brief introduction to Conrad, I met Conrad through a colleague, Christian Fischer, who was Conrad's advisor at the University of Tübingen in Germany. When I met Christian, I assumed he was already a PhD student. He is now, but at the time he was an undergraduate who just blew me away with everything that Conrad did. Conrad worked really closely with an undergraduate here, Macy Birchfield. These two were like a dynamic duo on everything they worked on. And in fact, I hope you two can like meet here because we spent so many hours on Zoom meeting. And so Conrad and I worked together for many years. At the time, Conrad was interested in psychology with a focus on clinical psychology, a lot of interest in cognitive psychology. But through our work, Conrad started asking more about doing work in educational data science. With the advice of many people, especially his advisor, Conrad completed a master's degree at the University of Oxford in data science, and then was pursuing PhD programs in Europe and in the United States, and decided to start a PhD program at Carnegie Mellon in human-computer interaction with a focus on education-related topics. And so Conrad has just started this program, and so
1 week.
1 week. I've been really excited to have him here to welcome Conrad to the United States and to learn about the work he's already done and the work he plans on doing, and to give Conrad a chance too for us to share ideas and feedback with him. Conrad's been extremely impressive as a scholar already. He's published 5 journal articles, including an Internet in Higher Education and Educational Researcher. He's been really active presenting at various conferences, collaborating. I just learned that he has a collaboration with a faculty in California, in addition to his advisor at Carnegie Mellon. I'm really excited about the work he's going to do, and thankful for the chance to have this presentation today.
Thank you so much, Josh. Yeah. All right, welcome too. Thank you so much for coming, and lovely introduction as well. Thank you so much for that. I will also keep it brief with regards to introducing. There might be some overlap, yeah, today. Oh, there's someone joining. Hello. Take the time. So yeah, I've arrived in the US a couple of weeks ago, and I'm very happy to be here today to share some of my work. Particularly, one of the themes that I want to explore in my PhD is how data science as a discipline can potentially improve educational research or educational processes, meaning not only learning on a micro level where you look at student technology interaction, but also more on a systemic level, potentially where you look at longer term student outcomes, which is probably one of the most intricate problems in education. To be able to predict and improve these processes. So today I brought to you essentially 2 projects or lines of research that I've been pursuing. One is with Josh and more in the realm of social media research, and the other one is with the California professor at UC Berkeley on student workload, which is kind of germane to this idea of student outcomes in higher ed, for example. Let's see. Can I Okay. So a quick introduction. I'm sure you already realized, but I'm not from the States. It's my first time here actually, and I like it thus far. I grew up in the northern western part of Germany in a town near Bremen. You can see it's a little bit northern than London essentially. And I was curious to pursue some field which is kind of related to education. I wanted to become a teacher initially, but then I was pretty much discouraged from doing it, unfortunately, by some of my teachers at the time. Fortunately, I then discovered psychology as an area of research that I like quite a bit. And then I kind of went on and worked with Josh, realized that I really like quantitative research and coding, and then I kind of tried to combine the two. And now I'm at CMU. We're still going through the advisory matching process, but it has been a very rewarding experience thus far. I really thought, what are my research interests before coming here? Because obviously they're not fully fleshed out when you start at graduate school. But I thought about questions that I find really interesting, that I want to pursue, and they kind of align obviously very closely to what I've done before, which is first, how do teachers and educational stakeholders use social media? So obviously, social media has transformed our world and the way we interact quite a lot. But I think there's a little bit of a gap potentially in investigating how it changes educational processes. So there are students and teachers that use it for classroom practices, but also teachers somewhat use it privately as well. And one of the large blind spots that we investigate is how institutions use social media. So for example, school districts. Another question I find interesting, which is kind of picking up some psychology, is how can we maybe quantify and think about student workload? Obviously, we have credit hours as a measure to represent the time spent on courses in higher education. But from our intuitive experience, we probably are aware that some courses are more difficult than others. Some require more work than others, so some might be more stressful than others. So how can we potentially come up with an analytics or prediction that can kind of represent that more accurately? And then finally, what is more relevant to what some of the work at CMU is thinking about teacher attention and student motivation in the context of education technologies. So they have been developing, for example, some classroom tools which allow a teacher to gain more insight about their students through data that is actually collected during classroom sessions. And one of the research projects that I potentially will join is thinking about how this data can be used for teachers to understand the motivations of the student better, but also understand how their allocation of attention resources essentially affects how students learn and how actually they can use them more effectively to make the students thrive, but to also maybe address questions of equity and fairness in some sense. Because obviously allocation of attention is a very ethical topic as well, how we prioritize and such. But let's maybe dive into the goals for today. Essentially, I'm happy to chat also beyond this talk about these research threads. But for today, I really want to give you a very brief primer of how I like to think about data science in the work that I do. And also particularly thinking about the challenges of kind of taking data science research and then applying or maybe extracting some relevant lessons for practice. Because the problem with a lot of these big data studies is that you can essentially analyze data day in and day out. And essentially, you might actually shoot in a different direction than what is actually applicable and important. At the same time, you want to maybe address blind spots and things that aren't looked at in practice at the moment. So I kind of want to talk about the interplay of these two things. So to kind of give you an idea of why I like to think about this topic is because when you apply data science to social data, so for example, educational data, you immediately stumble across three problems, I would say, in every research project. And for me, those are essentially operationalizations. So this is meaning, how do we measure and quantify a certain construct? For example, student privacy threats. How do we quantify that? Or teacher attention, student motivation, workload in higher education. And you might think there are different ways of quantifying it. You might ask the people via surveys. Some psychologists also collect physiological data of, for example, arousal or focus that can speak to these different constructs. But sometimes the problem is that you don't know how you operationalize things, and you have to go to literature, and sometimes different operationalizations lead to different conclusions. Then the second problem is second order effects. So that every time you do research and you publish it, society might pick it up, or practitioners and scholars might pick it up. And as a consequence, the object that you study changes as well. So for example, if there's a correlational study on tomatoes and the cancer risk, and it says, wow, eating tomatoes increases the odds of developing cancer, people might start eating less tomatoes, and then when you do another data collection, this correlation might change. So this is something to grapple with, and kind of related to that, populations change as well. So potentially the proclivity to develop cancer after consuming tomatoes might also be a cultural, might be mediated by cultural or other geographic influences too. So I would say when you go about this journey of doing data-driven research with large data sets, it's very helpful to think about these in advance. And I would be curious to know whether in your work you have also struggled with any of these. So feel free to raise your hand or like indicate that you actually thought about these at some point. All right. So let's dive into the first research project. So kind of move from the abstract to the more concrete. So this is a credit to Josh as well. I think he kind of got us started with this project by just essentially finding that in the NCES data set of public institutional educational data, there are links to institutional websites of US school districts and US schools. And when you then download the contents of these websites that are linked to the URL, you will almost certainly always find a Facebook link, which is probably in the vast majority of cases the institutional Facebook page. So what we essentially did is we took all these links from these websites, extracted the Facebook ID, which is kind of linking to the Facebook page. And then we used something called an API, which is essentially a means to download posts and other contents from these Facebook pages in order to generate a data set of around 18 million posts, which I found really impressive when I first heard this, which covers actually 81% of US school districts and 5.66% of public US schools, which I personally think is quite impressive too. And you might wonder, what are these different institutions actually posting? So this is actually in our first meeting, I think what was the question that we discussed quite a bit. So we had no idea what this data set is about. And essentially we asked, are there potentially some, because then we obviously started looking into the data and we started to look into these posts, and we were finding that a lot of these posts highlight students. So for example, accomplishments or other achievements of students. We were wondering what are some potentially privacy risks attached to that. And what we did then is how you often do is you hand code a sample of these posts, randomly sampled from posts with images, which is around 12 million of them, or 13. And then we looked at privacy sensitive variables, which is saying, are there particularly students with faces and names that are identifiable, which is kind of, we did this because we thought, okay, if there are privacy risks, which we are not aware about, or as educational researchers not familiar with, every potentially privacy risk will only unfold if we can connect the content of the image to a particular identity, right? So first we thought, what is the general extent to which students are identifiable in the data set, to go from there. So what we essentially did is we hand-coded the sample, and then we tried to come up with an estimate of how large, statistical inference, how large actually the ratio of identifiable students is in the full data set via extrapolation. So we fitted this linear model, which predicts whether a student is identifiable or not. And then in the second instance, we also thought maybe there are differences across the degree to which students are exposed, and sensitive information might be gathered across different NCS districts. So we actually found in one study that the district size and also the number of likes is positively associated, for example, with this privacy risk. And also, interestingly, we gathered a poverty index from SAIP, or SAIP, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that was also positively associated. So this is something to maybe scrutinize in further studies. But interestingly enough, when we now, after having presented this work to conferences and finding that there's actually a lot of hundreds of thousands of posts that potentially have identifiable students in them, we now think about actually leveraging the second order effects that I talked about earlier, right? So the fact that we publish research and as a consequence practice changes. So we actually want to share more about this research because we believe that even just informing these institutions that post about students might actually help to understand that actually just, for example, not posting the full name of a student, you know, first name and surname, might actually already go a long way in mitigating the degree to which students might be identifiable. Obviously, if it's a very rare first name, there might be another issue attached to that, but actually this is something we want to investigate further, also by potentially designing an intervention and also looking at how differences across US states with regards to existing privacy sharing policies like FERPA might influence or may be associated with these sharing practices. So we could imagine sampling, for example, across a state line, you know, different school districts and schools and see when the state line changes, so when the FERPA and policy changes across these two states, that's then also the privacy practices of these institutional Facebook account changes. So essentially, this is just very rough. And for me, I see that as only a starting point of a larger research program. So what we need and want to do in the next steps is to, like I said, sample more deliberately across maybe different regions and states, but also be more precise about the particular risks, because it might not only be about one post where a student is named with name and face, but you might be able to trace different data from different posts across multiple instances in order to reconstruct identities, which is something that Borchers and colleagues did with a data set of, I think it was medical psychology related studies. They actually looked at public, the anonymized data sets, and were able to actually reconstruct a lot of unique identities from them based on maybe 4, 5, or 6 demographic attributes. So they actually showed that the more attributes you take into the equation, the more easy it is, obviously, to reconstruct an identity uniquely in the US, for example. But it's actually much easier than you think. So actually, with these anonymized data sets, there's obviously also a problem with these sharing practices in general. And then another thing we want to explore is also more AI-based content tagging, because we as researchers not always have access to the same AI that tech companies have when it comes to the processing of very large, for example, image-based data sets. So we also want to look more into how we might, for example, sample Facebook posts with photos in order to automatically tag what's in them and then kind of link it to particular privacy risks. Any questions? I might stop here for a moment. The water would have come in handy, but don't worry. Okay, so this is the privacy research project. The second one is the student workflow project, which is with Zach Carlos and UC Berkeley. By the way, I will later link to my website where you can find all these publications. So this is work that really just came out a couple of days ago in Internet and Higher Ed. Essentially, the story here is, again, we discovered a data source which might be underappreciated. So this is also one of the take-home messages I feel for today, is when you do data science research, it's kind of a lot about being creative in the beginning, what the particular aims are, or like the questions that you address, but also like with what data you then use in order to answer them. So in this study, we actually thought about, hey, there are so many student evaluations that are done each year, each semester, also in Europe and Germany, by the way. But we know very little about, and we don't often ask students about how much work actually a course was, or like how they felt when completing the course. Interestingly enough, we also have, despite this, like a huge institutional data set across different institutions, which is learning management system data like Canvas, where you can look at interactions, like how many forum posts were made, how many assignments were graded, and so on. And you have enrollment records when the students drop out, how good were grades, that you might link to these different course load ratings of students. So we ask ourselves, when it comes to credit hours, can we potentially go to a more precise estimate of student workload? And what we did essentially is we surveyed students, asked them about their workload experience, and then connected this to these LMS and institutional data. But what's interesting about credit hours is that it's a historically very time-bound estimate of workload. So it was introduced in the 19th century by Charles Eliot at Harvard, who said, okay, now that we have the elective system, so he can introduce the elective system, right? Now that we have the elective system, we need a standardized way of actually saying, this student did this and this work, so now they're eligible for a bachelor's degree, for example. So the original conceptualization of credit hours was to say, okay, you have to work, or like the instructional time is so and so many hours in a week. So it was very time-based. However, when we look to psychology, when you look at workload and how it has been studied in work psychology in particular, what's often looked at beyond time load is also psychological stress, most pronouncedly via surveys and self-ratings, but also mental effort, which some of you might have heard in learning sciences, that you potentially can measure through eye tracking, but also through student self-report, how much mental effort a particular learning task imposed on the student. So we thought, actually, when we could do a survey, let's actually not only look at time load, but also let's also survey students about mental effort and psychological stress, and we adapted a survey for that, which I would be happy to share. And then we essentially asked students at the end of this semester to rate courses they took on these dimensions. And now the interesting part, after fitting again a linear model, which is often the way to go, we found that the variance explained, so variance explained is essentially the correlation between a model inference and a particular outcome, is actually much higher when we include these institutional data than when only compared to only using credit hours alone in prediction. And that's actually a 6-fold increase, or more than 6-fold increase in accuracy. And the top features, and I think this is also quite intuitive if we think about it, were course GPA, and also the availability of non-letter grades, but also the number of course prerequisites and late LMS dropout, which is kind of how often the students end up not staying in the LMS course towards the end. So interestingly enough, this model finding essentially says, even if there are courses with the same credit hour designation, there's a very large variance of difference in perceived workloads for students when it comes to taking into account also the course GPA. For example, you could think of grade leniency, so how easy it is to get an A. I learned that this is apparently important course selection criteria, also at CMU. And also the number of course prerequisites, which you can think of as prior knowledge required to complete the course. So again, brief discussion about this. This is also ongoing work, and you might ask, how do we actually translate this into practice, which is something I promised to touch on. So essentially what we need to do now is to think about how are currently students choosing courses, and how can we support them potentially in this analytic to, for example, choose courses that they can actually deal with, because they might end up, for example, choosing a credit hour load that is relatively low, but by virtue of not knowing that some of the courses are actually more intensive than the credit hour designation, they end up overloading and then not reaching their academic goals, essentially, or potentially even dropping out. So we don't know this, and we're currently studying this. And one of the problems that this research potentially has is replicability. So we at UC Berkeley have a pretty lenient policy when it comes to using these data for research purposes, but that is definitely not the case for other institutions. But I could imagine already reducing the feature space to things like GPA could probably improve inference quite a bit. And also one of the things we grapple with is student variation. So we know from psychology that the ability to cope, for example, and deal with stress differs quite a bit across individuals, and we were able to model that as well. However, you might think, is the prediction maybe more accurate for some students than others who, for example, have more private reasons, for example, to not be able to deal with particular courseworks, and how can we account for that? So those are open questions. And also, the validity of this research is the ongoing work. So kind of validating it, for example, with actual academic outcomes. And then also integrating it into course advising could potentially be very norm-breaking to not only look at credit hours, but also have such an analytical tool. And then obviously we need to do user testing where we actually involve these course advisors, kind of give them this metric and then see how that actually changes when the students choose different courses, because it might not change the student selection at all. We don't know that yet. So I think this is a brief overview. I will close with maybe a summary of the most important takeaways, I would say is, so when I think about these research studies, I often feel that there's a lot of potential in them to actually change educational practice. However, it's actually much more than only just analyzing the data and publishing about it, but it actually is, in the first instance, a question of using the right data sources, the right operationalizations, being a bit, I would say, creative with it, like applying, for example, workload to student workload in higher ed. And also, it's also important to think about how your results can then be translated in practice. And then also find the needs, find the correct next steps in order to actually work with the stakeholders, be it the states, the US school districts that have Facebook pages, of course, advisors, to kind of see how the results might translate into practice. So with that, here are some nice references. And my contact, please feel free to reach out. I would be very happy to talk. I will be here until Monday. Yeah. And also, you can find all the publications on my website, and yeah, the Internet and Higher Ed one, and the one with Josh. You can search for Josh probably, and they will all pop up. And yeah, also feel free to follow up later. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Conrad. I want to start with any questions from Zoom-based attendees, just to make sure that you aren't left out here. So does anyone on Zoom have any questions that or thoughts you'd like to share, ask or share with Conrad?
Someone just arrived.
Okay, we'll come back to anyone on Zoom if you have questions after talking in the room for a minute. So yeah, anyone in person here have any questions or follow-ups or thoughts that that might be of note to Conrad about these two studies, or how data science is used in education in general?
I was curious if you could expand a little bit more on the psychological stress and how that was measured for that study.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So in our study, we essentially adapted the SWOT survey, which is essentially just a survey where you ask students taking this course or completing coursework for this course, how much psychological stress did you experience? So, and normally in survey research, you want to make sure that normally you ask this question in different ways multiple times to get a reliable estimate, which is something we did not do in this case, but we had also these different questions that we then combined to the combined workload score. So we actually found that the clearest signal or the best prediction can actually be made when you average these different facets, which goes to show that it actually makes sense to also think about constructs in multiple facets, right? And also, other than that, in psychology, psychological stress can be measured with physiological responses. So, for example, when I was an RA back in my undergrad, we had to study on student self-explanation, because that might be a stressful event, you know, when you have to explain something to a peer and you don't really have mastered the material. And then we had a wristband, which essentially measured skin conductance. And I could point you to another study which also measured skin conductance, but also heart rate and heart rate variability all at the same time, because the problem with these measures is that they often are not as reliable or don't correlate as much. So we often want to have multiple measurements at the same time to kind of see how they correlate. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. I don't know if you would measure the cortisol levels or something like that. Cortisol.
Cortisol, yeah, that could be another. I've seen this a lot in studies that look at stress levels throughout the day. Yeah, so we have the circadian rhythm and cortisol levels. Yeah. So and you can see actually this is a clinical note, not really relevant for this, but you can see, for example, in the patients with depression that these cycles are somewhat disturbed or different. So yeah, this is another interesting way. Yeah.
I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the data set for the second study that was referring to workload. I'm particularly interested in knowing if there's a way to distinguish between the format of the courses that were part of the data set.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so sorry, yeah. So you mean this instructional format? Yeah, this is actually one of the research questions we posed. So is there a correlation between instructional design features of the course and their workload? And we try to approximate these instructional decisions with the LMS data by saying, okay, so we had features like how spread out are the assignments? Are they all kind of towards the end? How many were there? How involved were the instructor in the forum, Canvas forum, for example. So I would be very happy to send you that. We also have code that can reproduce this feature engineering process. And however, what we did not do is kind of try to classify what pedagogical school or pedagogical approach was behind that. So I think that might be a bit difficult to glean only from the LMS data. For that, you might need the classroom interaction data or Zoom data. So in the study, we actually say this might be future work to actually go and collect these interaction data and look at these pedagogical approaches, because they kind of imply as well maybe something for workload. Or they might have assumptions about student learning workload and then see how that actually corresponds to the actual workload experiences. So that could be something, yeah, I find this a really interesting project. Hope that answers the question. Yes.
When you were discussing the social media research, you addressed how just doing the research could affect the data, like when they know you're collecting this data, might affect how they post. Is there something similar happening with other data? Like if professors know you're collecting data on their courses, will it change how they develop their course?
Yes.
Is that a concern?
Yes. So there's something. So when you enroll in the experimental psychology class, or like at least my professor did this, he actually gave us a list of all the biases that can be induced during the data collection process. So there could be expectation effects too. Like let's say a teacher likes a particular methodology or particular intervention. They will obviously put in more work in order to make it work and to kind of engage the students. So, and also what you point to maybe is that just the fact of being surveilled might change behavior too. I think that's a big concern in EdTech in general, or some of the work that is done in CFU. And one of the things we currently do, I'm not sure how much I can share about this at this point, but actually is to ascertain how comfortable students and teachers are with different degrees of data collection, or like how aware are them. And then actually seeing how that corresponds to outcomes. Another thing you can do is to try to randomize, obviously, different experimental conditions, but it's not always possible with these interventions. So I don't really have a concise answer to that. In this study with the course load, so we kind of gathered that from all the existing data. But I suppose if you would want to make more, because this is all correlation, right? So it could be that courses with a high GPA, so there has been this discussion, for example, about course GPA and student GPA. Is it that good students enroll in difficult courses, or is it that different levels or types of students enroll in different courses, and then they have. So it's not always clear with the correlational data whether we have a causal effect or whether it's self-selection. Also with workload, that's a problem. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have a good answer, but it's an important concern and different ways of addressing it exist, I would say. Yeah. Feel free to follow up. Yeah.
Who could also exist the workload between within the same course with different instructors?
So this is a great point. So actually we said don't look at the instructor, because we don't want to. So this is also another data science thing. Interesting point to add. You have to be aware that every time you work with social data, you also have to be careful what conclusions you draw regarding individuals or groups, because you have to always take every finding with a grain of salt, I would say. And if we were now also looking, for example, structured data workload, this instructor imposes a workload, of course, that might be a bit dangerous or like a bit difficult to do pretty much. And I think we have to restrain ourselves, not because we should be like careful with what we do, but we should be aware that the work that we do is not always the truth, 100% of the truth, and the public might perceive it as such. And there have been multiple instances in history where research has been, particularly psychological research, has been published, and there had been interpretations laid upon the results, how society is or how certain people are. And even though the methodologies or the research at the time was underdeveloped when compared to now modern standards. So that, yeah, I'm probably expanding on this way too much, but I think, yeah, we thought about that, but we decided to not look at instructor level variables. But I would say if you were to go to instructors and have them voluntarily participate in finding out how their practices relate to workload and they consent, and somewhat like a teacher education study or effort, I think that could be fruitful. But for this, we didn't have the explicit, like not all instructors in this group are aware of the study, right? So it's, I think, something to touch at this point. Yeah.
Kind of a more meta question. I know that Rita and Sam are on Zoom and they're learning data science this semester. TC is well. Moreover, Leah and Rita at least are interested in like students learning about data and how to look at data. And I'm curious if you can reflect on the process of like learning about data science and coming to use it. More in a mode of kind of sharing about what about your experiences could have a bearing on how others either study it or learn data science themselves.
So I might share it on a more personal note. So I completed this one-year data science degree last year, correct? And so there we had people coming in with all sorts of backgrounds. So some people had no quantitative training. And then they were thrown into a Python class where they had to learn Python in 8 weeks and then to become a data scientist in 8 weeks, which is pretty intense. And there I observed maybe some of the dynamics at play that you were kind of asking about, or some of the mechanisms how people acquire or work with data. I would say one of the big problems in data science learning is that people apply methods without understanding them, potentially. So kind of knowing what a regression is very roughly, then throwing it on top of a data set and then making conclude. I think what I would like to see more in data science education is to start a lot with basic statistic principles, mental models of what a correlation is, how to interpret the small coefficients, what it actually means, what a machine learning model is. So I think that's all very important and useful. I would be curious to study how not knowing about these underlying principles translates into different uses of data science as well and different research practices. I had a statistics professor or like teacher in undergrad who was extremely great, but he also grappled. So he was a little bit, I feel, frustrated with some psychologists because they hated statistics. They just want to get it done, but he actually, I learned this from him. It's not my own idea, of course. So I learned from him that actually what matters quite a lot is being able to understand the statistics and then using it effectively, rather than choosing the method you always use. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I think in psychology there is a paradigm that thinks about knowledge as schemas or individual components, right? So you could think of Jean Piaget, like the baby throws a ball and it bounces, and then the baby throws an egg and it breaks. So the thing learns to distinguish the two concepts. And I think it would be interesting to apply this lens or this knowledge component lens to data science. Anyway, yeah, just an idea.
Thank you. Does anyone online have any questions for Conrad? Anyone else?
I don't know if this is almost like a question or a comment or do something, but the sort of things that you mentioned just recently, these psychologists and maybe not interested in statistics.
It's a generalization. I don't want.
Right, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And no, I don't mean it like that, but just a metric that I wonder how it could be measured is motivation in these studies.
Yeah.
And maybe comparing where like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation comes into play and how that correlates. Sort of where it comes from.
There are psychological surveys to measure interest. And I think there was so the scale is by Holland. I don't remember exactly when it was published, but the two main components of interest, when you measure it, when you apply the survey and you measure what correlates within the different interests, is people versus things. And then I think there was a study, so you have the two-dimensional spectrum, right? And your interests are maybe high in people, high in things, high in people, low in things. So, and then I think one study looked at how this, how people score on these spectrums depending on the subject they study. And obviously psychologists would be high on the people spectrum, and I don't remember what they were on the thing spectrum, but you could use this in order to potentially make a prediction how motivated or interested they might be in statistics. What do we do with this? I don't know. Obviously, the problem with these scales is that they assume that people come in with a certain interest, and obviously you can develop interests too. For example, I never was exposed to CS or coding before entering undergrad. In retrospect, if I wouldn't have anticipated, but in retrospect, I could have picked up much earlier potentially. So that's another thing with data research. It always makes an image of what is the status quo. And we should also be careful with kind of thinking about also changing the status quo, I guess, and kind of thinking about how we can engage people that don't bring a high interest because they may be unfamiliar with the subject, and kind of go from there. If that makes sense. I don't know if this answers the question.
I don't even know if there was a question.
Yeah, sure. This makes me think.
Well, thank you all again for taking the time. Thank you I want to give a shout out to our online guests, Sarah, Emily, Vita, and Sam. And also thank you to Nick Kim for moderating and leading the online part. Couldn't have done it otherwise. Thank you all again for your time, and thank you, Conrad, so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
We will